Welcome to the CTO Demon channel. I've been asked by my good friend Paul Kao to record a live in the box CTO master case for his summer meeting TSCI meeting in Taiwan. The title of my case is A Poor Unfortunate Man. This poor unfortunate man is a 54-year-old man who is an ex-smoker, diabetic, hypertensive, hypercholesterolemia. He presented in 2012, 11 years ago, with ACS and APO. After the APO settled, we went in for a coronary angiogram, which shows a mid-LAD CTO, proximal LAD 70% lesion, distal circumflex CTO with a dominant circumflex, and a proximal RCA CTO. He underwent coronary artery bypass grafting with a lima to the LAD and SVG to the OM, but unfortunately, the surgeons could not find a target to graft in the distal circumflex nor the RCA CTO. So not surprisingly, 3 months after the bypass, he had recurrent angina, and he suffered angina for 11 years until I saw him in clinic a few months ago. This is the angiogram originally in 2012, and you can see the proximal LAD has about 70% lesion. There's a distal LAD occlusion, a circumflex occlusion, and a proximal RCA occlusion, with the collateral channel coming from the distal circumflex through a lateral wall channel to the PLV supplying the distal right. We repeated coronary angiogram for him, and the graft to the OM is patent. The proximal LAD lesion is worse than before. It's now around 90% lesion. The distal circumflex is still there. There are very dominant septal collaterals, ipsilateral collaterals from the LAD to the circumflex. The graft to lima is patent, and there's a very tortuosity in the proximal LAD. At this point, we decided to undergo PCI to try to treat the proximal LAD lesion so that we can open up the septal collaterals to go retrograde to do the circumflex CTO. We're hoping to do all of this in one sitting. Unfortunately, the fellow who was doing this struggled tremendously with the proximal LAD, and required a buddy wire system to get a balloon down even to balloon the LAD. Finally, he managed to put in a stent in the proximal LAD, which was unfortunately complicated by proximal stent edge dissection into the distal left main. He had to cover a second stent in the left main, and took almost 2 hours to get to this point where the left main and the proximal LAD is treated. At that point, I said, well, we're 2 hours in. I'm not going to start a retrograde now, but it's worth giving an antegrade try to see if we can get the circumflex. So we continue with a Guyanix 2 wire, which went down the circumflex a little bit too easily for my liking, and it looks like it's subintimal. So in the end, we tried to swap down to a workhorse wire into the OM. We ballooned it with a small balloon and checked with IVUS, and not surprisingly, the whole track is subintimal. So we decided to do an investment procedure and balloon this with a 2.0 balloon, and then decide to stage him for a relook in 2 weeks' time to see if we can do this. Because by now it's already 3.5 hours on table, and the patient is very uncomfortable, and he says he cannot tolerate the table anymore. He needs to get off. So we allow him to go home, and 2 weeks later, we brought him back. This is the angiogram, and the fellow who was doing the angiogram was very keen. He saw that there's flow down the distal circumflex, so right away he went with the workhorse wire, and he flew down into the distal circumflex, and he says, "Oh, Dr. Wu, you don't need to come in. We've sorted the problem out." And I said, "Well, you're likely in the subintimal space." This is his wiring into the distal circumflex that he's very proud of. He did a floor stroral for us. And of course, we put an IVUS down, and not surprisingly, the whole thing is in the subminimal space. So you can see the distal IVUS here is in the subminimal space. The true lumen is at 9 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 6 o'clock. And you can see how big the subminimal space is and how small the true lumen is now. There's a slither in the 7 to 9 o'clock area. And finally, in the proximal, everything comes back into true lumen. So since we got the IVUS there, and I thought, this poor unfortunate man, he's already suffered once under the surgeons who couldn't graft his CTOs. He suffered twice under my fellow who took so long to do the LAD and then put the wire into the subminimal space. And now my third fellow who just wires straight down the subminimal. I thought, let's start treating him properly and try to do the CTO. So since I have an IVUS there, I decided to go for IVUS guided wiring. With a Guyanix 4 wire, I repunctured the proximal cap, and this time I managed to get a puncture into this true intraplaque space, but not the true lumen. So this is the IVUS, and you can see in this IVUS, the wires and inside the plaque at 9 o'clock, okay, at 9 o'clock, just behind the calcium there. So we managed to puncture back into intraplaque, but not into the true lumen. I then stepped down to a Gladys ES and tried to wire the distal true lumen, but unfortunately, After this wiring, when I did the IVUS, I realized that in the distal part of the vessel, the Gladys ES is in the subintimal space. It goes back into the intraplaque space, not in the true lumen, okay? And so we've managed to overcome one subintimal entry by going into intraplaque, but distally, the wire goes back into the subintimal space. So I tried to redirect the wire, but the redirection didn't work, and the wire is still in the subintimal space distally. This is proximal, and you can see it's intraplaque, and it's quite near the true lumen, but it's not in the true lumen. And distally, it still goes back into the subintimal space. So the problem is there's a septum between the intraplaque and the true lumen, and the wire is on the outer curve of the vessel, while the IVUS is on the inner curve. The true lumen is between the IVUS and the wire. So I thought that's a good time to try to use fluoro-guided 3D wiring. So use the IVUS to correspond the angles and just point the wire towards the IVUS and puncture. So that's what we did. And you can see here in two views, the wire is pointing towards the IVUS, and this is a CPST wire, the sharpened tip CP, very high penetration force wire. And we try to puncture. But what you see happening is when you puncture, it punctures through the plaque back into subintimal space. It doesn't puncture into true lumen. And we did several punctures. This is 3D tip direction wire. You can see the tip, the wire disappears. When the wire disappears, it's pointing downwards. So it's in front of the true lumen, or not, the true lumen is at 3 o'clock to the wire, and the wire is pointing downwards. So we need to counterclock this 90 degrees to puncture forward. So we try to do 3D wiring, simultaneous and puncture. The problem is if we use a very stiff wire, it tends to go to the outer curve. If we put a big curve in the stiff wire, it tends to penetrate all the way through the plaque back into subintimal. If we use a not stiff wire like an XTA, it's not strong enough to penetrate into true lumen. So this is an example of the CPST. You see it's now pointing towards the IVUS, but once you penetrate, it goes too far. So we chose an intermediate wire, a Conquest 9-gram wire, I think hoping that it can penetrate the septum, but not all the way through. And indeed, it turns out to work. This is the puncture. And once we punctured, it felt good. I did an IVUS to confirm the wires in the true lumen. You can see the wire now is in the true lumen. And distally, I didn't push the wire. So distal to this, you can see the lumen without the wire. But proximally, you can see the lumen with the wire. Then under IVUS guidance, I pushed the fine cross down to the tip of the wire. And when I can see the fine cross on the IVUS, I pull the wire out and step down to a Sion wire. And I wire down to the distal vessel. And I ballooned the Sion, and I did another IVUS. Here you can see the IVUS is now in the true lumen. The false lumen at 3 o'clock with the wire still inside there. A big false lumen at 3 o'clock here you can see. So after this, I pushed a microcatheter, the fine cross, down to the subintimal space on the first wire. I put out a wire, I put an indeflator and pull negative onto the fine cross. This is to suck the extraplaque blood out while I'm doing stenting. I waited for 2 minutes before I put a stent down, and this is, you can see the fine cross microcatheter is the dark spot there, and you can see a stent coming down. And this I call extraplaque blood withdrawal stenting, EBW stenting. And this is the first stent with the fine cross black dot there, second stent, and after I stent you can see a fantastic result because we pulled out all the hematoma, so none of the side branches lost, and we've got true to true vessel lumen wiring. So at this point, we're about 2 hours in the procedure. I know the patient can tolerate around 3.5 hours on table because that's how much he tolerated last time. So I decided to do the RCA for him as well. With the same Sion wire already in the distal circumflex, I wired through this lateral wall channel to the PLV. And the Sion wire can get to around here before getting stuck. I pushed the Suzanne microcatheter across, and I stepped up to a Gladys ES. But as the Gladys ES got to around the mid-RCA, it got a bit lost. And you can see this angiogram, it's outside the vessel architecture. So at this point, I wanted to know what I should do with my retrograde wire. But I want an easy reverse card because I don't want to spend a long time doing reverse card in this case that's already long. So I went with the UB3, I punctured the proximal cap, and the UB3 felt very much like subintimal space. So of course, I want to put the retrograde wire in the subintimal space to make for an easy connection. So I pulled back the retrograde wire, switched out for an XTA wire, and I knuckled the XTA up. And I tried to knuckle it harsh so that it goes into subintimal space. The first bit of the knuckle, you notice, is quite a small knuckle, so it's probably still staying within the intraplaque space, but at this point near the mid of RCA, the knuckle becomes big, and you see we are probably in the subminimal space. So I switched out the antegrade for a guide extension catheter, the 3.0 balloon, and I switched out the retrograde for a GAN 3 wire, GAN X3, and I did one puncture, end balloon puncture, end balloon wiring technique, and I could easily wire it into the guide extension catheter. After wiring the guide extension catheter, I trapped the retrograde wire with a balloon, but the CSI cannot cross the mid-RCA. And so I decided to turn to rendezvous technique. I put an antegrade turnpike spiral microcatheter, and I wired it with the retrograde GAN X3. After successful wiring of the turnpike spiral, I can easily drill the turnpike spiral down into the PLV, and I move the CSI microcatheter back from the retrograde system until the two are a little bit apart in the PLV, and then I removed the retrograde wire and I wired the antegrade into the PLV. And with the wire in the antegrade PLV, I moved back the turnpike spiral catheter, and then I ballooned the lesion, and then I put in an IVUS, and you can see the IVUS in the distal part is all in true lumen. And as we move towards the proximal part, the IVUS goes into the subminimal space for a very short segment before coming back into true lumen in the ostium. So I'll let the IVUS play through, and you can see here the IVUS is in the true lumen, and the mid-RCA is still in the true lumen. And here there's more plaque, and here the IVUS is moving into the subminimal space, and you can see the crescentic subminimal space with the true lumen at 6 o'clock, and very proximally, just beyond the proximal cap, it goes back into the true lumen like so. So after this is easy, I just balloon and stented the thing with a very nice angiographic result, and I completed the procedure in 3 hours and 25 minutes. The patient could still stay on table, and with a very nice angiographic result. So finally, this unfortunate man got total revascularization through a series of techniques. And in summary, we use IVUS guided wiring. We use all three types of IVUS guided wiring: the longitudinal live IVUS puncture to get back in the proximal cap into the intraplaque space. We tried live 3D wire directing, and we tried fluoral combination IVUS guide wiring, but both was not successful. In the end, it turned out we needed just the right penetration and stiffness wire to be able to do 3D IVUS guided tip detection method. And we stepped down to a Xeon wire. We did EBW stenting, and we did a retrograde to the other side, and we used the antegrade puncture and retrograde knuckle, and end balloon wiring technique, guide extension reverse card, and finally needing rendezvous to complete this case. So I hope you enjoyed this case with so many different techniques that finally allows this patient, after 11 years, to have blood flowing to his 2 CTO lesion. Thank you for following and watching. I hope you join the next video.